So we're getting ready to celebrate a momentous occasion here this upcoming week. Anybody know what we're going to be celebrating as a country? 250th. That's right. The 250th anniversary or birthday, I don't know what to call it, anniversary birthday of our country, when these men signed the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. It's 250 years when these words were written down. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Before these words were written down in what we know as the Revolutionary War, in which we gained our independence from Britain, there was another revolution that happened in our country that preceded the American Revolution. It isn't necessarily called a revolution, it's called the Great Awakening that happened in our country starting in the 1730s into the 1740s. And what happened during the Great Awakening is a revival happened in the colonies where people were changed by the life-changing hope of Jesus. And there were some men that were well known, they're preachers, that you would call them, that went around and traveled through colonies preaching the gospel of Jesus and the freedom that is found in Jesus Christ. One of those men was a man named George Whitefield. And if you want to watch a really, really interesting movie, I would highly recommend watching a movie that just came out a while back. It is out on the streaming services now, so you could get on any Amazon or whatever and watch it. It's called A Great Awakening? A Great Awakening. And it's a really interesting story because it's a story of this man named George Whitefield, who was an amazing speaker and able to communicate very well. And it's a story about him and the relationship that he had with Benjamin Franklin. They came into business together when George Whitefield came to the colonies and was going out preaching the gospel to people. And Benjamin Franklin became friends with this man named George Whitefield. Benjamin Franklin was, in his early years, a deist. He believed that there was a creator, but he did not believe that God ordained or that God was involved in human affairs. He believed that God just created everything and set everything in motion, and that God just left everything up to us to figure out, and God really wasn't involved in the life of human beings. We'll see that changed later on in Benjamin's life. But we see this revolution that happened in the 1740s, this great awakening that happened that gave people spiritual freedom in Christ. People who were dark and despair in these colonies at the time, and light came through the message of the gospel of Jesus, and many people became followers of Jesus Christ throughout all the colonies, and it united people together, people all different denominations coming together under Jesus. In fact, it's known that from the liberty that the people experienced through Jesus Christ eventually led them to think, boy, we want liberty from this tyrannical king that we're under, and which eventually started the Revolutionary War, or the Declaration of Independence that ended up being signed. You can actually hear some of the same words that preachers were using back in that time that we can find in the Declaration of Independence. Do you know a book that was often used, or the preachers often preach from leading up to and during the American Revolutionary War? Anybody want to take a guess? You'd be very surprised. But one of the books that was used often preaching about freedom and oppression is the book of Esther. The book of Esther in the Old Testament. Now, I have personally never have preached through the book of Esther before, but that's what we're going to be looking at over the next several weeks is this book of Esther. And the title of this series is For Such a Time as This. You know, one of the things that the people during the American Revolution did was a famous sermon actually in 1775, so 1 year before the Declaration of Independence. There was a Reverend Oliver Noble, and he gave a famous sermon in Newburyport, Massachusetts, titled Some Scriptures Upon the Sacred Story Recorded in the Book of Esther. And during that time, the sermons that were given, they would equate, or they would put in the titles of some of the people in the book of Esther, like the king, who we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, King Ahasuerus, or better known as King Xerxes. They considered King George the third, King Ahasuerus. And the villain in the story of Esther, his name is Haman, and we're going to be talking about him next week. They gave to Parliament during that time, the British Parliament. And the heroes of the story, Mordecai and Esther, that we'll be talking about, and they're introduced to us today, they represented the faithful colonists who had to step up and save the people. And this was often used in the sermons that were preached of equating the people in British rule to the story of Esther. There's some very interesting things about the book of Esther. One thing that's very interesting is that in the book of Esther, the name of God is never mentioned. God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Another interesting thing is that prayer is never mentioned. It never says, you should pray. They prayed. Now, there is a hint that there is some prayer involved, because at one point there is fasting that's mentioned. When you fast, you normally pray. Another interesting thing is there's no miracles in the book of Esther. There's no supernatural things that happen in the book of Esther. And so you might ask yourself the question, then why is the book of Esther in the Bible? Right? If God's name isn't mentioned, there's no miracles mentioned in the book. Is God even involved in the events in the book of Esther? And as we're going to find out as we read this book, the answer to that is yes. God is involved. One of the main themes of the book of Esther is God's providence. The providence of God. The definition of God's providence is this. Divine providence, or God's providence, is the governance of God by which he, with wisdom and love, cares for and directs all things in the universe. That is what is considered the providence of God. It's God's governance over all of creation, how he cares for and directs every single thing that happens in the universe. God is over all of it. God directs the affairs of all things. And what we're going to find out in the book of Esther, and particularly today, is how God is working behind the scenes. God is always at work, even when we can't even notice it. And I would even dare to say, God is working, and oftentimes he works more than just doing miracles. He's behind every single thing that happens. And oftentimes when we think about God working, right, we think about God doing some kind of miracle, doing some kind of supernatural thing, and we think, well, that's God at work. But God is always at work. And the book of Esther reveals that. Another theme in the book of Esther that we're going to find out, and this is the reason why the Revolutionary War, the men, the founders of our country, and the preachers during that time used the book of Esther, is freedom. Freedom from oppression. And we're going to find out that providence and freedom really go together. Because when we look at the book of Esther, it is going to become evident that the only freedom, the only reason why God saves his people, and I'm not going to get into all the details because I don't want to give it away too far in advance, but God saves his people from a great danger, from annihilation, from being oppressed, being annihilated. And the only reason why that happens is because of the providence of God. So, let's look at the book of Esther together today. Just some background in the book of Esther. So, the Israelites were taken captive by the Babylonians and King Nebuchadnezzar around 586 BC. Jerusalem was completely destroyed, and many of the people were taken captive. They were exiled from Jerusalem, from God's holy land, right? That God had promised to them. They're exiled from them. They're taken captive back to Babylon. This is in 586 BC. This is the time period where we think about people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? The fiery furnace in King Nebuchadnezzar. We think about Daniel. And during this time, God's people, the temple had been destroyed. They had no temple. They're away from their land, right? It's almost like they'd be like, God, where are you? And why are they in exile? Because God had warned them over and over again. Right? I made this covenant with you. You need to obey your covenant. But they kept worshiping other gods, not listening to the commands of God. And God, over and over, being patient as he is, was saying, hey, if you don't shape it up, if you don't stop worshiping the other gods, you don't send me this, I'm going to send another nation in, and you are going to be in exile. But what did the people do? They didn't listen to God. And so God exiles them. And after the Babylonian Empire fell, the Persian Empire became the dominant empire. And in 538 BC, the Persian king, Cyrus the Great, he allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, and they began to rebuild the temple. And this is where we get the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. In the book of Ezra, he was a priest, and he helps lead the rebuilding of the temple. There was approximately 60,000 people who returned from exile to Jerusalem. But the rest of the people, the majority, which is an estimated 750,000 to maybe several million of the Jews, of the Israelites, they stayed in Persia. Of course, Jerusalem is considered part of Persia because the empire, they were part of the empire necessarily back then. But they stayed in the area of the Persian capital and the cities and all that around. So only 60,000 people went back to Jerusalem. The rest of the people, after you live somewhere for 70, 80 years, right, you get used to things. Even though this was God's holy land, and everything that God had promised, the people are like, well, we're just going to stay here. And so majority of the Israelites stay in the Persian Empire. The book of Esther begins in 483 BC. So basically 100 years after God's people had been taken captive into Babylon, and they've been in exile. And the book of Esther unfolds over a 10-year period. I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this book. Because oftentimes, right, when we're reading stories in Scripture, we like read one chapter, read the next chapter, and we think it all happens like all kind of together, Well, that was probably just like several weeks apart from each other. This all happens over a 10-year period. And if you were to read the book of Esther, you would find out that the book of Esther, the events that happen in the book of Esther, happen in the book of Ezra and between chapters 6 and 7 of the book of Ezra. Ezra is all about God's people coming back and they're rebuilding the temple, right? And they were trying to restart religious life, religious following the laws again, obeying God's laws, doing the temple again. And it happens in between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. In Ezra 6 and 7, there's a 60-year gap timeline. And that's just where the book of Esther takes place. Ezra's chapters 1 through 6 covers the first group of the exiles that returned to Jerusalem and they're building the temple. Then you have Esther that happens and takes place. And then Ezra chapter 7 and 10 is when Ezra the priest gets permission to leave Persia, and he goes and they start the spiritual revival for Israel as the temple is rebuilt and the laws are beginning to be followed again, and God's people begin following God. So that's just the timeline of everything. So let's look at Esther's chapters 1 and 2 together this morning. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, this is King Xerxes, the Greek name Xerxes, and this Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the Sentinel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him. And while he showed the riches of his royal glory and splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. All right, so the Persian Empire is absolutely vast. It is huge. Because it says it's from India to Ethiopia. This is basically the miles from east to west is like 3,000 miles. North to south is 1,500 miles. It's basically comparable to the continental U.S. of A. All right? This is how big this empire is. Huge, vast amount of land that the Persian Empire held at this time. And King Ahasuerus has 127 provinces throughout this whole empire, and he brings in all these nobles and officials. He's trying to impress the people that he is over, and the military people that he's over, because he is hoping to go and conquer the Greeks, the people west of him. Eventually, the Greeks defeat the Persian Empire, and that's where we get Alexander the Great and all of those. We're getting a history lesson today. But the empire was vast and huge, and he throws this huge party, basically, and he's trying to impress these people because he wants them to get on, he wants to basically snooze them up to be like, hey, let's go defeat the Greeks. And so the 180-day party that he has, and after the 180 days, he throws a great banquet, a 7-day banquet. And I won't get into all the things, but just, it gives you a picture a little bit. In the palace, I mean, this place was just absolutely decked out. I mean, it talks about there's white cotton curtains, violet hangings, marble pillars, couches of gold and silver. Every person that was in this banquet, the 7-day banquet that he throws, they got their own vessel, their own golden drink to drink from. The king gave the command that, hey, you can drink however much you want. And usually it was custom that any time that the king would drink, then you would drink. But the king was like, no, you just drink however much you want and enjoy yourselves for these 7 days. And then in verse 9 it even mentions Queen Vashti, who was the queen. She even had her own festival with all the women going on during the time that King Ahasuerus was having this big 7-day festival. Now let's get to verse 10. I'm skipping over some of the verses because I just want to read everything. But verse 10. Now, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, what does that mean? He's drunk. Because he was like, hey, drink as much as you want, everybody. Well, the king is drunk. He's drunk on wine. And he commanded his eunuchs, and I'm not going to read all the names of his eunuchs, but he commanded his eunuchs, he's drunk, and he was like, hey, he says, bring verse 7, bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So the king, in his drunkenness, was like, go bring my trophy wife, and I want to show her in front of everybody here. Now, his intentions were not like, hey, I want the queen to be able to meet everybody and to have it, like, he simply just wanted to show his wife off. Now, it was mentioned too, and you can't say this for sure, but it only mentions that she should be brought with her royal crown on. So it is speculated that he was the king was like, I want her to show up with only the crown on and show her off. And it does make sense if that was happening that way because of the response that happens here next. Because in verse 12, what happens? But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. He was mad because the queen did not listen to his command. And if you're a king of the Persian Empire and you give a command, what's supposed to happen? You're supposed to obey it. But Queen Vashti not. She refuses to come. It is known that from historians that King Ahasuerus had a little bit of an anger problem at times. And he became enraged. There's actually a story how he had a bridge built so they could cross over to another area that, as he was trying to conquer other areas. And a storm came and absolutely destroyed this bridge that he had made. He became so angry that he went out and beat the waves. You bad waves, you, not doing what I want to happen. And then he had the 300 people that built the bridge executed. So this is the kind of person that has some anger issues, right? So he's enraged. And then what happens is the king, he gathers all of his wise men up in the law and different things, and he gathers all these wise men up. And he asks in verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? And then one of his officials, then Memucan said in the presence of the king and his officials, not only against the king has the Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there'll be contempt and wrath in plenty. This is not only a problem for you, Kinesh, but what she did, now all the women are not going to obey their husbands anymore. They're going to just do whatever they want. Verse 19, so if it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. And the king liked what was said, and he made the edict happen. And so that goes out to all the provinces that the men should be, in every province in the script, that every people in the land that men should be master in their own household because of what happened with Queen Vashti. Now, if you're reading this and you're thinking, this is like a soap opera, it really does seem like a soap opera. You have the queen and him, and he gets mad because he doesn't listen. He's like, I'm going to find another queen, and I'm going to make this law, and it seems just kind of crazy. And now we get to chapter 2 of Esther, verse 2. So after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. He misses Queen Vashti. Now, the time period from when he gets rid of Queen Vashti into chapter 2, it has been 3 years. All right? So 3 years, King Ahasuerus hasn't had a queen, and he's lonely. He's like, I miss Queen Vashti. Verse 2. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem, and Susa the sentinel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of all the women. Let there be cosmetics be given them. Let all the young women who pleases the king be queen, or let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this pleased the king, and he did so. The king was like, I like this idea. And so in the scriptures we have recorded, really in history, the first beauty pageant that happens. Verse 5. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, the sentinel. Susa is the city, the capital of Persia. And his name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shema, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Keep that in mind about him being a Benjamite. We'll talk about that next week. Who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. Hadassah is a Hebrew name of Esther, and Esther is the Persian name of Esther. Esther's Persian name means star, and she really is the star of this book, as we will find out. And she didn't have any parents, and so Mordecai took her on as his daughter. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother had died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. And so the king's orders, they go out, and this edict is made. It goes out through all the provinces, and all the beautiful young virgins are brought into the harem of King Ahasuerus. And one thing that's noted here is that Esther is brought into the king's palace. And so she's put in custody of Haggai, the man who's in charge of all these women. In verse 10 it says, and the young woman, meaning Esther, pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young woman in the best place in the harem. So Queen Esther is brought into the harem with all these other women, but she gains favor with this man named Haggai. Meaning that Esther doesn't just have her looks going for her also, but there's something about Esther and just who she is that makes her stand out Miriam, that she forms this relationship with Haggai. And so Haggai gives her 7 women to attend to her and help her in this beauty pageant that she's in. And just to give you an idea of this pageant, there's this beautifying that goes on for 12 months. Like, the women go through 12 months of beautifying before they would be presented to the king. Guys, let's not be complaining when our wives take like an hour to get ready for something. They took 12 months. So, Esther had made known, in verse 10, Esther had made known her people, or her kindred, meaning she did not make known while she's in the palace that she was a Jew. For Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. All right, so Mordecai told Esther, don't tell them that you're a Jew. And there's a reason why, because the Jewish people are not necessarily Persians, right? They were brought over from Nebuchadnezzar many years ago, and so they're not Persians by descent, right? And so they were also known to be not treated as well in the Persian Empire. There was anti-Semitism, right? And so Mordecai's like, hey, don't tell them who you are at this point because we don't want any issues. And so that happens. So all the women are going to be brought in, and after they go through all this treatments, they will eventually, each one will be brought before the king. And if the king delighted her, then they would stay in the harem. But if the king really wasn't fond of her, then they would go to the other harem, which was known as the concubine harem. I won't go into what that is. Hopefully you already know. All right, so they would go into that. But so each one would have this one night with the king. And so that's what the whole preparation was for. And so it came time for Esther to go to the king. And even she would go in the morning she would return. And so verse 15, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus, into his royal palace, in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, and the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all of the women. And she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all of his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So Esther, after all that time, going through 12 months of beautifying, she gets to go before the king. The king finds favor and grace. She won his favor and grace, and he crowns her queen of Persia. Just think about that for a moment, right? Really at the time, a nobody, a young woman, not known to anyone, who's in a place in which she originally wouldn't have been in if it wasn't for the Israelites being taken captive to Babylon. 100 years has passed, and she's in this huge empire of 50 million people at the time. And this young Jewish girl becomes queen over the biggest empire at that time. Is that interesting? Is that a coincidence? Verse 19. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold. The threshold is basically the door to the king's chambers. The guard of the threshold became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. And he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told it to the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Okay, so Mordecai, right, is the uncle to Esther, but basically he is the father of Esther because he took Esther to be his daughter. She's made queen, and it seems right here that Mordecai is given some kind of position, official position, probably due to Esther becoming queen. And so he's at the king's gate. And he just is there at the king's gate and just so happens to hear these two men talking about a plot to kill King Ahasuerus. And so Mordecai is able to tell Queen Esther, who then tells King Ahasuerus it's investigated and find out that this was a real threat, a real plot, and these guys are executed, and it's recorded in the presence of the king. There's another foreshadowing here to something later on that happens in Esther that we'll get to. So Mordecai does the right thing and does what he should have done. He notifies the king to make sure that nothing happens, and the plan is thwarted, and the king is saved. Was Mordecai just there just by happenstance? Or was there a reason why Mordecai was there? You see, we can look at these first two chapters of Esther and we're just like, okay, pretty interesting story. But what does that have to do with God and his providence? God is working behind the scenes. Think about this for a moment. The book of Esther is all about God rescuing his people. That's what the book of Esther is about. In the first two chapters of Esther, we might look at it initially and be like, okay, well, how's God at work? Well, think about this for a moment. You have a king who's not a godly king, right? He's not a good king. He's drunk. He gets upset when his queen doesn't do what he wants her to do, so he deposes her. She's no longer queen. And then eventually he gets sad because he doesn't have a queen. And then the idea is like, well, we'll have a beauty pageant. And so they have this big, huge beauty pageant. They bring all these virgins. And then it just so happens that this young woman, Esther, this Jewish girl, is brought into the harem, and she ends up being chosen to be queen. And then you have this Mordecai, he's put into a position, an official position into the kingdom, and he hears about a plan to execute the king, to get rid of him, and he thwarts the plan of the king. You have all these things happening. All these little things happening where certain people are being put in certain positions, where the events are happening, where you have an ungodly king who's drunk, and somehow because of that, you have Queen Esther. How does that happen? It's because of the providence of God. It's the providence of God. Benjamin Franklin, later in his years, after his friendship with George Whitefield, during the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the states were having a lot of issues trying to come together to form a constitution together. And Franklin gave a famous speech. He called for daily prayer to happen as they would meet together every day during the Constitutional Convention. And he talked about how in the early days leading up to the Revolution, when they would meet, they would often always begin with prayer, calling out to God for help. But they had gotten away from that. And so he declares or asks for daily prayer to be reinstated, for divine assistance. And he famously notes this: the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men. Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, he was like, God's not involved in creation. God's not involved in human affairs. He declared, the more that I have been alive, the more convincing proofs that I have seen that God is involved in the affairs of men. Brothers and sisters, God is involved in the affairs of not only the universe and everything in it, he's involved in your affairs. He's intricately involved in your life. It doesn't have to be some kind of miracle. It doesn't have to be some kind of supernatural thing. God is involved. And he's always working behind the scenes. And we don't notice it oftentimes until after the event has happened. I'll give you one small, little, tiny example. And it's probably not the best one. But last year, when we went on vacation, we're heading to Panama City Beach, Florida. I got the GPS on. Sometimes I don't like the GPS because it sends me different ways I want to go. But I have the GPS on. And we're getting close to Birmingham or Montgomery or something. I think it was Montgomery, Alabama. And there's supposed to be a turnoff that I'm supposed to go. And I'm just minding, I'm going and I'm just minding my business, listening to music. Well, I realize I passed the exit that we were supposed to go like 15 or 20 minutes ago. And if you know me, I'm the kind of person that my goal is how can I shorten the trip as much as possible to get to where I'm going. So I'm upset because I'm like, oh man, I just probably added an extra 20, 30 minutes to our driver getting there. So I'm telling Manny, I can't believe I did this. I missed the exit earlier. All right, so we get to our hotel. And normally when we get where we stay at, we upgrade our room because we usually have a room that's facing the city instead of facing the ocean. And we're we drove all this way. We'd prefer to be able to have a room that we could look at the ocean on. But we always have to wait till we arrive to be able to do that. So we get there, and we're like, hey, can we get our oceanfront room? And they're like, oh, we're so sorry, but we are just all sold out of oceanfront rooms. And we were just like, oh, are you kidding? Man, we're going to go and we're not. And I know this is you're come on, Bryce, this isn't a big deal. But we're just man, we drove all the way to the ocean and we weren't going to be able to stand out in our room and just be able to look at the ocean our whole time here. And we're just so bummed. And then we're okay, I guess, we're going to get a room. And literally, 2 minutes after that happens, all of a sudden the clerk was hey, a room just opened up right now. And we were book it, get it. And me and Mandy were if we would have got here 30 minutes earlier, we would have already been on our room facing Panama City instead of the beach. Now, we can look at that, and I can look at that, and we can just be well, that's just all a coincidence. Or was it? Was God being gracious to us in that moment? That he ordained all that happened, that I missed my turn so that we could be able to be on the beachfront hotel that we wanted to be at. Because we have no idea how God is working. He's always working behind the scenes. He is always involved. His divine will is always happening, and he's using even fallen evil people like King Ahasuerus for his plans to happen. Isn't that amazing? God is at work. He's at work in your life. He's at work in our life. And he's working behind the scenes, oftentimes when we can't see it. And one of the simple things that we can do in response to that is be thankful to the God who is involved in our life. Even when we don't like it, even when we don't like the circumstances, we can be thankful that our God is involved and he is working behind the scenes. I can tell you, in the last week when my mom passed away, in that week, a few days leading up to it, one of my hopes that I had was I wanted to be there with my mom when she passed. But I ended up having kidney stones, and I didn't get to be there. And at first it was really hard. It was one of those things where like, God, why can't I be there? Because that's what I desired. And it's interesting to me because I had been listening to sermons on the book of Esther and all that leading up to all this about God's providence. God's involved in our lives. And it was one of those things where I realize, even though I didn't get to be there like I wanted to be, I trust the providence of God. And there's a reason why. One of the things that interesting that happened was the day of that I had my surgery, the night, I think it was the night before the surgery. It's confusing with all the timeline, but there was an issue with our car. Like, Mandy was at the hospital driving the van that I normally drive. I was going back and forth in. And this might not have been a thing that happened, but it is interesting that when she was pulling out of the parking lot of the hospital that night, she's leaving from the hospital from visiting with me, the front part of our bumper like starts to come off, and there's like a piece of plastic or something that fell off the car. And so it made you wonder a little bit of like, well, I would have been driving the car to Evansville, Indiana. Like, could something have happened? Like, all of a sudden, like, that came off and caused something to happen. You just don't know. And that's where the providence of God comes into play, where we just trust God and that he's at work. And we may not understand it. And later on, we might see down the road, as we're going to see in Esther, why God was doing what he was doing in the first two chapters in the book of Esther. Let me pray.